The Nuts and Bolts of Writing, Season 2, a podcast where we talk about literature, the ins and outs of writing, and how to actually start writing. Hi, everyone. Today we have a guest, Cynane Shay, the author of an upcoming book about fundamentalist Christianity and conspiracies in the United States, Taking Off the Tinfoil Hat. You can find her on Instagram at taking.off.the.tinfoil.hat and on her website, takingoffthetinfoilhat.com. Cynane grew up in a small conservative town in Florida. She grew up alongside many fundamentalist Christians, many of whom now believe in conspiracy theories about biblical end times, QAnon, and the flat earth. In Taking Off the Tinfoil Hat, she seeks to explore how these crackpot conspiracies led to the dismantling of her patriotism, evangelicalism, and her entire worldview. Her book will also be a warning commentary on the increasing polarization in the US and how current events eerily parallel historical fascism. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we're going to dive into the questions to explore more about your book. And the first question is, how did you get the idea to write this book?
So it's really kind of a memoir. A lot of it is my own personal story. So I didn't really get the idea. But what kind of spurred me to actually start writing stuff down, because I definitely do not have a background in writing or literature or anything like that, was all of the conspiracy theories and things that came up in 2020 around QAnon, and especially for my family around COVID and vaccine hesitancy and things like that. I had countless conversations in person, via text, via messaging and things with a bunch of people in my life. My mom, several of my best friends, my brother, and I could not make any kind of progress. I was just met with conspiracy theory after conspiracy theory. And I started also kind of looking into cults and cult thought reform or mind control tactics and how that kind of works, because it just did not seem, the conversations I was having were very, you couldn't get anybody to just agree on anything. So in order to deprogram, and not everybody likes to use the word deprogram, but basically to get somebody to leave a cult or a cultic belief, and it's very similar to talking somebody out of a conspiracy theory. Most of the successful people in that field, everything that I've read kind of talks about interventions. So you gather everybody's loved ones. It's a very emotional process. It is not an intellectual process necessarily. And you have to, really get down to the root of why they believe what they believe, not just address the surface conspiracy theories or the surface beliefs. But I was not capable of doing that. Instead of having an entire community sit one person down and stage this intervention, it was me as one person trying to do that for an entire community. And I don't live in my hometown anymore, so I'm physically not there all the time. And there was just too many people to do this for. So I thought initially, what if I just write it all down? What if I write down everything that I know and I address things as deep to the core as I can think to address them? And, basically I'll write an essay and I'll just give it to my parents like a little kid and just be like, please stop hoarding hydroxychloroquine. And I started writing it out, and I realized that it was going to be much longer than an essay, and that it went way deeper than I had initially anticipated it to. And I just kept reading book after book after book, um, and a lot of touching on a lot of different topics that I realized needed to be incorporated into this. Um, and it kind of became a book. And so I just went with that. And that's kind of how I decided to, uh, what made me start writing a book. It was kind of by accident.
That makes a lot of sense. Yes, definitely. During the pandemic, I felt like a lot of people started believing a lot of these things. Also because of social media. I think a lot of social media became more and more polarized and more extreme during the pandemic.
Social media played a huge part in it. And honestly, I mean, there are people who are doing research into this. So like there are experts, but I do also think that it's kind of a new phenomenon. Like social media has not been around for long enough for us to truly understand how it's going to affect us psychologically, like on a large societal scale. But there are people who have been doing basically like radicalization, just little studies or little experiments of like how quickly does it take somebody who, so for example, I've seen several of these studies where they would only like anti-LGBTQ content, or they would pick one topic and they would only like a TikTok video related to that content. And by doing that, they eventually were being shown things from like the Three Percenters, or the Proud Boys, or the Oath Keepers, or these are like very extremist, violent white nationalist groups, or like extremely violent, like anti-trans content within a matter of hours. So when you social media, my parents are the quintessential boomers. All right. So they are not on TikTok. They are not really even on Instagram. They're on my dad's not on anything. My mom's on Facebook though. And, so they're not doing, the TikTok radicalization, but they do end up finding these ideological echo chambers. It connects them to people who believe the same things that they believe. And when you've accepted something as a, premise, as an idea, it's very easy to down spiral into that. So even just something as what's basic for me, maybe not anybody listening, of like biblical end times, like the rapture, very much like Left Behind, the Tim LaHaye book series of like the Antichrist taking over the world with like a new world order, all of that. That was very common in just like my evangelical community. So if you just accept that as truth, and then you go on social media and find things connected to that, it very, very quickly tailspins into some very extreme conspiracy theories, and very quickly into like anti-COVID conspiracy theories. So it's something that I think needs to be studied a lot more. And I know that it is being studied, but social media plays a huge part.
Definitely. And even without social media, like people like your dad, they already have something called Fox News to enforce their views. And Fox News is very, very extreme, and I think has become more extreme in recent years, especially since Trump became president.
Fox News. Yeah, so my dad is definitely not on social media. But it's like life finds a way, like extremism finds a way. So he is, and he fishes for a living. Like he's old Florida man, loves to talk to strangers in diners, like exactly what you would expect, shows you pictures of fish on his phone and like all of that. But he will literally get emails from his old man friends who are also like 70-plus-year-old men who don't have any connection to social media. One of the last times I saw him, he came into the room super upset because somebody had sent him an email, and it was literally just like a chain of memes. My dad doesn't know what a meme is. And one of them was like, oh, this is very racist. So like a trigger warning, I guess. But another one of the conspiracy theories that I grew up with was that like Obama was the Antichrist, or that he was, secretly Muslim, or that he was a terrorist. And like, that was very normal for me, like, to hear as a kid. But one of the memes that he just got recently, like in the last 2 years or so, was a obviously photoshopped picture of Obama with like a turban on his head and like a 1995 desktop computer. And like the caption said something like, selling our secrets to terrorists or something. And my dad like thought that was real. Like he couldn't even tell that it was photoshopped or that it was fake. So yeah, it doesn't take just social media. Like when you're in, what I have come to realize, and what is kind of like the principle to the second half of my book, is that, the problem is not conspiracy theories. The problem is not QAnon. The problem is not even Trump. The problem is the ideology that all of this is based on. Like, what is at the root of all of this is white Christian nationalism. And so you have to address, like, why do people believe in white Christian nationalism and adhere to that? Because that's why somebody like my dad, is afraid of COVID vaccines, and is believing in, Obama conspiracy theories and things. So, yeah.
Yes, I totally agree because, I've been reading about this subject too. And one of the books I've been reading recently, I think was featured on your Instagram. I think it was called John Wayne and Jesus. And it's a really fascinating dive into, how all of these things are connected, especially since how, this idea of white masculinity and how that's connected to evangelicalism going all the way back to the early 20th century and maybe even before.
Yeah. So, I would love for any of your listeners to check my Instagram, just to see the book recommendations, because that's really like what I am the most excited. And one of the very first books that I read was Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Kobes Dumez. I might be saying her name wrong. I'm so sorry. But oh my God, that is one of the most important books in all of my lists. Her book specifically, it's kind of like a journalistic look at white Christian nationalism, specifically in relation to Christian patriarchy and male headship and complementarianism, and basically just like the subjugation of women in the white evangelical church and the history of that. As you said, going back for basically the last century, it does go much farther back in history. And there's a couple other books that I have recommended that I would highly recommend, especially Anti-Intellectualism in American Life by Richard Hofstadter. That's really not connected to religion in any way. Not really. It's just he's a historian. So it's a historical look at anti-intellectualism in the United States going all the way back to like the 1700s. And I think that plays a huge part into evangelicalism today. But the other element of this that Kristen Kobes Dumez does touch on in Jesus and John Wayne is the racism that is present in evangelicalism, white Christian nationalism. And there are a couple other books that I would highly recommend related to that as well. The Color of Compromise by Jamar Tisby was earth-shattering for me because I was raised in this white Christian nationalism. I understood Jesus and John Wayne because that was my experience as a woman raised in evangelicalism. Like, I understood that kind of oppression. But to read The Color of Compromise as a white person, it just exposed what I feel like had been whitewashed and covered up throughout my entire childhood. And the other one that I actually read before that was Divided by Faith. And I love Divided by Faith by Michael O. Emerson because he's a sociologist. And so he uses a lot of polls and statistics and numbers. And I'm attracted to that. And it kind of talks about a little bit like why white evangelical, white Christian nationalists are essentially racist. It's not like a nice thing to say, but like the entire religion is built on a history of racism, and the white Christian nationalist like rejection of the idea that there is still systemic racism in the United States, or that this country was built on systemic racist, laws and history. They reject that. And Michael O. Emerson in Divided by Faith kind of gives a little bit of a sociological look into why.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense, because from what I've seen, it seems like a lot of evangelicals, they do not like, some of them anyways, they openly admit that they do not like civil rights. They think that it was not necessary. They think that state rights, which is a code word for many things, are more important than civil rights. And they're saying, oh, I only oppose civil rights because I don't want the federal government intruding on me. And this also goes back to, this American idea of, anti-centralized governments. And that's also connected to the evangelical idea of the one world government, I think.
Yeah, there's so many like connected lines. Like I feel like a crazy person. But a big part of it too, and I haven't read this book in a long time, and I'm going to like go back before I like try to write about this, but a big part of it is the principle of individualism. It's a philosophical concept, very big with like John Locke, the founding fathers, like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and that whole lot. They were heavily influenced by John Locke and this idea of individualism. And that goes hand in hand with capitalism and the modern American conception of Christianity, or specifically Protestantism. We have all of these different denominations. And the reason why we have a lot of those denominations is because of almost kind of like a capitalistic principle of them marketing themselves to different groups of people in different ways and different times to make them more popular. And so and the part of individualism that really impacts the racist element of all of this is because it's almost like, we have accepted Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior. And so if you believe in hell and heaven, we get to go to heaven because Jesus died for our sins. That's what they say on the surface. But when you look at it on a different level, like a little bit deeper, you chose to accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior. So you kind of saved yourself. Like Jesus saved you, but you saved yourself by choosing to follow Jesus. And so if you don't choose to follow Jesus, you deserve hell. And if that ties into this American individualist idea of you should pull yourself up by your bootstraps. If you're not willing to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and save yourself, then you deserve to be poor. You deserve to, not have health care or, any of the other issues that we're facing. And it really ties back into just like the very basic concepts of white Christian nationalism, this belief in heaven, this belief in hell. Calvinism is kind of a little bit of a different thing, but it's very much deeply run into that with, the chosen elite versus the unchosen. And then you have prosperity gospel, which is just vile. But, if you're a good person, God blesses you. So if you have a lot of wealth and a lot of money, then, you must deserve that because God is blessing you. Whereas if you're poor or if you're sick, then you must deserve that because you must have done something to deserve that. And so it just allows people to just sidestep empathy and justify not doing anything about it, like send thoughts and prayers, not, money or volunteer time.
Mm-hmm. And also they feel like a lot of the stuff that's anti-individualism, for example, socialism or, socialized healthcare. They think it's an extension of communism.
Yeah. And that, again, Richard Hofstadter has written some incredible like histories looking at the anti-intellectualism around the McCarthy era, like the OG McCarthy, not our McCarthy now. And the just absolute panic that was around the Cold War and, the communist wave. And, I think that this is especially relevant to us because, I'm 30. So that was my parents' generation. They lived through this Red Scare and this idea of godless communism. They very successfully, through propaganda, tied the idea of communism to godlessness and a rejection of faith. And so it made it inherently evil, not just, a social, like an ideological social structure or like, a thought experiment. It is now like morally evil because it's been tied to this godlessness. And we're still living with the effects of that propaganda that was like child indoctrination into our parents. We're still living with. And you can talk to, I'm using my family as a case study. And I understand that other people are a little bit different, but you could talk to my parents about socialism, fascism, Marxism, communism, and ask them to describe the difference between all of these capitalism. They could not. They fear it because they don't understand it, and they don't understand it because they've been told not to. It's almost become, and then you get into the anti-intellectualism again. It's good for them not to know about it. They don't need to learn about what they already know to be a lie. Like when I was a kid, I was always told never to study the Quran or to study like Christian cults or any of these non-Christian groups because you don't need to study what is a lie. You should only study the truth. I can't tell you how many times I heard this growing up. They used this analogy of, and I don't know if this is true, but in the United States Treasury, people who work for the Treasury don't study counterfeit money. They only study true American money so that if you hand them a counterfeit bill, they can tell just by touch that it is false. And so they told us, you don't need to study other religions to know that they're false. You just need to study the one true religion. And so I think that ties into kind of the anti-intellectualism around socialism and communism. Like we don't actually need to understand it. We already know that it's wrong. And it's also feeds into a lot of conspiracy theories because anywhere where there is this ignorance, it's going to be filled with fear and misinformation. So, and then you have, and what's happening now in American politics is just these people who see that as an opportunity and step in as bad actors to take advantage of these, now very large swaths of the population who kind of fall into that category.
Definitely. Especially since so many of these themes are tied together. And in a previous episode, I discussed, homeschooling and how that's tied in too. I think that ties into anti-intellectualism because a lot of people who homeschool their children, they believe the government has no say over how they can educate their children. And, I've heard people, for example, the Ron Paul homeschool, there was one where he interviewed an alumna from his school, and she said, I don't care if someone teaching me has a diploma or not. I get to decide what I want to learn. And just because someone has a diploma teaching me doesn't mean they're legitimate.
Well, and that's something that I heard over and over and over again with the conspiracy theories, in the last couple of years was like, do your own research. And at one point, my ex-best friend who had to kick out of my wedding because she thought that 5G radiation could control her mind, showed me like, it's not about I can't remember the exact quote, but it's very nearly like, it's not about like what's right, it's about what's right for you. And I was like, no,
Mm.
it's about what's factually correct, you know, when you're discussing something that can be factually, you know, figured out. But the whole homeschooling thing, I did listen to your episodes on homeschooling, and anybody who has not yet done that, please go back and listen to them, because I was like yelling at my phone like, yes, yes, everything that you guys are talking about. And I want to say that like I definitely recognize that there is a need for homeschooling and in spaces, and especially for people and children who might have like you know, learning disabilities or medical situations, or you know, there's a plethora of, you know, reasons why homeschooling would be a very good option for families. And I know several people who do homeschool very responsibly, but I was raised around, all of my friends were homeschooled, and they were religiously homeschooled. And so my experience in general is that it is just used as a tool of control. It is a violation of children's rights, because they use it to prevent education. It is so that they can indoctrinate children however they want to, at the expense of them receiving a proper education. And so you end up with this generation of adults who are coming out of this high control child indoctrination, lack of education, homeschooling, who are then faced with the real world that they have never experienced before, and they have no way to, they don't know how to handle that. And so they basically have to like start from a point of such disadvantage as an adult, because their parents did not give them what they needed as children. And a lot of times, and especially for women, and you know, I don't want to make up like too many broad generalizations, but this is what I saw growing up. um you know, they don't expect it to become a problem, because they don't expect you to ever face the real world. They expect you to grow up, become an adult. Especially for women, you'll just marry somebody at 18 or 19 years old, and then work in the church, be a housewife, and you know, you'll never have to figure out the real world. And for the men, you know, you can work in the church, or you can work in your family's business, or you can stay in your very small town. And so you're just not faced with having to figure things out so much. But if you do try to leave, if you do try to support yourself, you have nothing to do that with.
Mhm.
And it's a means of control. People are discouraged from leaving the group or the church or the family or whatever it is, because it's so difficult. And I don't think that most of the time this is done maliciously. I think most of the families who are homeschooling their children are doing it because they genuinely want the best for their kids, and they are afraid of a satanic, demonic world that they're trying to protect their children from, but that just doesn't exist. And so you're just children's rights, with good intentions.
Yeah, but you know, the intentions don't mean anything if the result is so terrible, unfortunately. Yeah. So yeah, all of these things are connected, and you know, it's very interesting that your book will explore this, because I think sometimes a lot of people don't necessarily tie the conspiracy theories to these underlying problems.
Um, right. And like when I was growing up, I was surrounded by conspiracy theories, and I either just didn't recognize that they were conspiracy theories because they were just so normalized, or, you know, especially as I got a little bit older, I just thought like it wasn't that important. It's not that big of a deal. For somebody like my husband, who was not raised in evangelicalism or white Christian nationalism, um, you know, somebody like him, they don't think that, he sees my family and he's just like, oh, well, they're just crazy. They just believe some crazy things, and like they're just like they're on the fringe. But the problem is that they're not. That these are the, you know, cultural forces that are very deeply rooted at the highest levels of our government and just like society in general, the education system and the battle that you see going on right now for like parents' rights and the fight against CRT, and somebody like Mike Pence or Mark Meadows, who are deeply involved in like evangelicalism and these evangelical lobbying groups and stuff. People just don't realize that it's all connected. And that's like, my book is kind of just how I went through that through my own memoir, so like I saw people talking about Jewish space lasers and microchips and mind control, like 5G radiation mind control. And I was like, oh, something's wrong. And so I started looking into conspiracy theories. And then through looking at conspiracy theories, what was at the bottom of that barrel was white Christian nationalism. So it's kind of I tried to write it in sequence of like the things that I learned in the order that I learned them, because that's just how, if my thought was that, like, if this is what kind of changed my mind, or things that I didn't know as somebody who was an evangelical, then I think that hopefully my path would lead some other people in the same direction, or at least if I didn't know it as an evangelical, then this will be information that other people maybe just didn't have.
Mm-hmm. Right. That makes sense. So how have you been writing this book? Do you follow a set schedule, or do you write whenever you have energy or inspiration?
That's a good question. It's kind of a mix. I definitely do not write on a schedule. And for anybody who's listening to this, like as a writer, this is where you should ignore everything that I say, because I have no idea what I'm doing. I work full time. I'm a civilian contractor in the Navy's nuclear propulsion training program. So um, I work full time. We are renovating our house. I just have to like live my life, in general, like making dinner and stuff. Like we take trips and things on the weekends. So I have to work around all of that. So I am probably slower than like a professional writer would be. And then as far as like inspiration and stuff goes, um, the the first half of the book I have drafted, and that is mostly my personal story. So I really had a firm grasp of like where I was going with all of that. And it was just a matter of filling in the finer details. So um, that was pretty straightforward. The second half of the book is definitely, I feel like I now have a much better grasp of it, but it's built on a lot of the ideas like I've been learning as I've been writing. So, there have been times where I had to like kind of pause a little bit, like read some books and really like digest some information to figure out like how that connects to what I'm trying to say. Um, and I'm still doing that. I think I will probably like I'll be learning for the rest of my life, obviously. I'll be reading and learning ideas that I want to put into the book long after the book is done, I'm sure. But yeah, so I'm working on it as fast as I can. And as far as inspiration goes, I would say the only thing that's kind of slowed me down a little bit is when I'm talking about like the really rough conspiracy theory stuff, like QAnon and anti-Semitism and all of that is like really deeply connected. It gets a little bit dark, and it was very demoralizing to just look at that, bald in the face, like that much hatred and ignorance. So I did have to take like a little bit of a break after that. So, really advertising what you guys are going to want to read when you read the book. But um, so no set schedule, and it's a learning process as I'm writing.
That makes a lot of sense. And yes, I totally agree about the anti-Semitism. I mean, there's so many theories that on the surface to a layperson doesn't seem anti-Semitic, but when you look closer at it, like, the lizards and stuff like that, it's obviously anti-Semitic.
Well, um, and I tell people about this all the time. Like people are like, please stop talking. But like people just don't know. I had no idea. But pretty much any conspiracy theory that's talking about a global elite is anti-Semitic
Mhm.
because there's two historical roots to this, and that includes blood libel, which is this medieval conspiracy theory that Jewish people were kidnapping usually children or Christian priests and sacrificing them in blood rituals. And this was just something that has been circulating through folk stories and conspiracy theories since the Middle Ages. Then, and this is like the really bad part, is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And I, off the top of my head, I don't have the dates right, but I want to say that sometime around like the 1900 point, um, there was this pamphlet that was released called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and it described a Jewish elite, a secret cabal, who were super wealthy and influential and controlling all of the world's governments and then it also involved like sacrifices and like satanic rituals. And it came out later that this pamphlet was literally just plagiarized from a French satire that had nothing to do with Jewish people. It was like a satirical pamphlet. Somebody stole that, injected a bunch of anti-Semitism into it, and then released it as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This, I think that the Holocaust Museum has like quoted as saying the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is like the single most damaging piece of anti-Semitic literature like in the history of mankind. Like it is horrible, because it has just been regurgitated over and over again in every single conspiracy theory. Anything that uses a global elite is really just copying the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And if you go deep enough down any conspiracy rabbit hole, you'll find people saying it's the Jews. So stuff is completely random as flat earth. They believe in a globalist elite conspiracy theory. You will find them talking about a Jewish elite conspiracy and secret Nazi bases and all sorts of stuff like that. So yes, everything QAnon, deeply anti-Semitic, COVID conspiracy theories, it always finds a way back to anti-Semitism if you remember all of the people wearing the stars of David for being anti-vaxxers. So yeah, no, it's gross.
Absolutely. It is terrifying. And, it's normalizing these beliefs because, people who may not be necessarily anti-Semitic, the deeper they get into this, they become more and more anti-Semitic.
Yeah, and that's something that I talk about a lot in QAnon, but it's also just a cult tactic. And that is soft pill versus hard pill. So you will get people to believe an idea on a surface level, not really understanding like where it comes from, before they actually truly understand it. So like with QAnon, you'll talk somebody into believing in a government corruption or a Bill Gates type rich elite cabal, or that child sex trafficking is a problem. All of these things are on the surface very believable and agreeable. So yeah, on the surface, all of that seems completely reasonable. Government corruption, these are all things that you can kind of be on board with. But what you don't immediately learn about is, ritualistic child sacrifice and adrenochrome and mole children and the second coming of JFK Jr. and all of these like other more crazy elements. And it's the same with, you know, most conspiracy theories. People don't just jump all in on lizard people. They jump in on something that is more palatable, and then they find their way to lizard people. Soft pill to hard pill.
That makes a lot of sense. Like, and I think that, you know, stuff in evangelicalism, even before QAnon and all this other stuff, it was already paving the way towards these beliefs, such as young earth creationism.
Oh my God, yeah. So I had like a little bit of a unpleasant epiphany a couple weeks ago. Remembering that Ken Ham, do you know who Ken Ham is?
Yes, Answers in Genesis, right? And
Yes.
Creation Museum.
Yes, like the man, the young earth creation king himself came to my school, which was a private Christian school, when I think I was in like kindergarten or first grade, and like gave a seminar. So like an officially sponsored school event had Ken Ham come give us a lecture. So, you know, I know all about that. The idea that like Adam and Eve were real people, and the idea that like Noah's Ark was a real thing, that the entire globe was flooded, and that there were dinosaurs on the ark. You know, like all of that is, yes, it paves the way to believe kind of crazy stuff if you already believe kind of crazy stuff. And the other thing that I think about, which is so interesting with QAnon specifically, and I should maybe like give a little preface for people who don't know exactly what QAnon is. At the heart of it, it was a message board. So like Reddit, 4chan, 8chan, these like super internet nerd places. It was a message board troll or prank where somebody was pretending to have a top level security clearance and in the government, and was like leaking secret information. And the secret information, the conspiracy that they were describing, was that there is a global pedophile billionaire elite that is controlling the entire world and driving the world towards this very evangelical one world order. But they're also running massive rings of child sex slavery with like hundreds of thousands of children. And some versions of the conspiracy theory, they're saying that they're even like breeding children, like mole children, in tunnels under every major city. And the only person who is fighting the elite is Donald Trump. They're Geodis, or like God Emperor of the United States, which is a play off of POTUS, President of the United States. It's all ridiculous. There's also a fun spinoff about Donald Trump being a time traveler. That's my favorite. But when you are presented with the idea rings of hundreds of thousands of children being sex trafficked and satanic ritual murdered, that's insane, right? And so you would think that there would be people out in the streets, like, you know, forming civilian armies to go fight the satanic cabal and like free all of these children, if they truly believed that that was happening. But there have been several incidents of shootings and actual crimes of people who did take this seriously. But on the larger scale, for the number of people who believe it, you would think that there would be more of that. But when you look at evangelicalism at large, at a group of people who believe that every single person that they interact with is going to hell to burn for eternity in torture and torment for eternity, every single person that they meet who's not a Christian, and they're not every single waking moment of their 80 years on this earth out there trying to save people from eternal torment, it's kind of the same thing, like, oh, there's just like, satanic child trafficking rings, and that's bad. everybody's going to burn in hell forever and that's bad, but it's in God's hands, or it's in Trump's hands. It's in some higher power. And so it's another obfuscation of responsibility.
Quick question. So now that Trump isn't that popular because, DeSantis is kind of replacing him, are people thinking that he's, their savior in the QAnon conspiracy or not?
So I think what's happening with QAnon, and I'm not a fortune teller, I have no idea what's going to actually happen, but I think that January 6th, the storming of the Capitol, really took the wind out of the sails of QAnon. Q stopped posting just before January 6th and went dark for a year or two or something. They have come back and have been posting a little bit recently, but it just doesn't have the same following. So I personally kind of think that QAnon, as a very centralized, rabid conspiracy theory, is petering out. It's gonna die. But I think that how QAnon has normalized conspiracy theories, especially in the right wing politics and in American Christianity, is going to be a lasting consequence that we're going to be dealing with for a very long time. And that's always kind of been the danger of QAnon, is that if you talk to somebody in my family or one of my friends who believed in a conspiracy theory, and you told them that you believe in QAnon, they wouldn't know what you were talking about. They wouldn't know who Q was. They wouldn't know what even adrenochrome was. They would be like, oh, I don't believe that. I just believe in government corruption or whatever. So I think what we're going to be left with is nothing but the soft pills. And we're going to get weird little spin-offs and flurries of weird conspiracy theories and stuff that turn up. Maybe somebody will be able to reharness all of that energy under one banner again. I don't know. But I think that, Trump is old. I think he's in his mid to late 70s. So realistically, he is not going to be around long term. Not wishing ill upon anyone, but DeSantis is a very real, very scary problem because he is young and he has the same populist following that Trump kind of had in Florida. Even after January 6th, talking to people in my hometown, one of my best friends, she was like, okay, well, maybe Trump is not the best. Okay. I'll give that to you. Trump has some problems, I recognize that there's some issues with Trump, but then the next words out of her mouth were, but I love DeSantis. DeSantis has not been tainted by QAnon or January 6th. So he's peddling the same snake oil, but he's just, in a different brand. So all of that energy will be focused. If he can harness it, I think he will. I'm very scared that he's going to be kind of like the next Reagan.
Oh, I think so. I mean, at this point, it does look like it, because who else is there in the Republican Party, other than him? And, as you said, Trump's getting old.
Yeah. And that's just going to be something that time will tell. And I am heavily biased, in one direction. I come from a world that is just steeped in right-wing conspiracies and racism and Islamophobia and, extreme connection between religious beliefs and political beliefs. The Republican power that Trump harnessed and that DeSantis is poised to harness is no longer just a political party. It is a religion, which is what makes it so powerful. But from my point of view, I'm very much like an alarmist, like, oh God, like this is what's coming, like it's everywhere. But again, somebody from my husband's perspective who didn't grow up in this, and like nobody that he's friends with believes any of this stuff. He's just like, it's not that big of a deal. So I think the answer is somewhere in the middle. But it is something that we need to keep an eye on. It's like having a spider in the room. Like you just want to know where it is.
Mm-hmm. Well put. Research is often the hardest part of writing a book, especially nonfiction. How do you find the process of doing research for your book? As you told me, you are an engineer. Do you think your scientific background has helped you with finding sources for this book?
So as far as research goes, and like a scientific background, most of what I am dealing with is not like high level science, like I'm not digging through equations and like scientific articles and research and things. If you were going to combat the specific conspiracy theories, I think that you could get into that. Like if you were trying to disprove hydroxychloroquine as an effective treatment for COVID, like you would go through the scientific research papers and, get into the nitty gritty of that. But that's not really what I'm doing. I'm again just trying to address the root cause of why people believe those conspiracy theories, not fight the individual battles. So as far as research, when I started all of this, I've been going through deconstruction, which is basically a crisis of faith. Because I was an evangelical. I was hook, line, and sinker bought into all of the religion. I was the good girl, did everything right. And so there's been this personal kind of psychological journey. And I've been reading a lot of books about that, which is why I'm in like cult psychology. But when I started, like, I didn't know to call it deconstruction. I didn't know what was happening to me or what to do about it, or that there were resources for me. So it's very sloppy, but I really started kind of on TikTok of all places. Started seeing videos of people who were ex-evangelicals, people who had left the church and were saying things that really resonated with me. And then, those social media influencers were referencing books. One of the first ones was Jesus and John Wayne. And then also Divided by Faith by Michael O. Emerson. That was a TikTok recommendation. So I went from, these social media influencers to some books. And then from there, books referenced other books. And I really found some very helpful podcasts. Straight White American Jesus, amazing. Love you guys. They talk to a lot of authors, and they specifically focus on experts and people with degrees, PhDs and professors, and, people with a lot of credibility. So I really appreciated that. And I went and I read a lot of the books that they recommended. And then QAnon Anonymous is another podcast. And that I still find this to be absolutely fascinating. They latched on to QAnon like months after it started, like well before it was ever in any kind of mainstream news articles. This was like a fringe thing that was happening on the internet. And these guys started this podcast following the conspiracy theory. And so when I figured out that my family was connected, their beliefs were connected to QAnon, I went back and I listened to like 2 years worth of QAnon Anonymous podcasts just to understand what QAnon was, as well as, like going on to some of the websites and like 8chan and that kind of thing. And, after I realized that what I was doing was called deconstruction, and I found, publishing groups of authors that were writing about this sort of thing, and, found that there was this history of racism and misogyny in American evangelicalism, and that there were a number of books talking about that history. I finally had like a direction to go in. And then as far as my like engineering background, how that has really tied into this, maybe, like I said, not directly on like a scientific level, but in two ways, I think that it has really affected the book, and just like why I have gotten to the point where I have gotten, and that is that I understand and appreciate expertise, because I do something that is highly specialized and highly technical. I just have a bachelor's degree, but it was a very difficult bachelor's degree in nuclear engineering. And so I understand that if somebody has a degree in microbiology or something that, I don't understand at all, there was a lot of work that went into getting to that point. You can't just like read one article and expect to understand the intricacies of reactor dynamics or whatever, microbiology is. So that's where I think I very much differed from people like my ex-best friend who said, oh, it's not about what's right, it's about what's right for you, or do your own research and that kind of stuff. And, for me, I'm just like, you're not a doctor. Like, you can't just like do your own research, read some article from some quack who, says you can take horse dewormer for COVID and like call it a day. Like, you have to look at the general consensus of expertise. So like that's a huge thing. And then the other part that is more personal, I think, for like why I'm like writing this as a book, is that my education gave me a confidence that I feel like some of the people in my life maybe don't have. I know that, so sorry, I'm like all over the place. When you come out of a cult, like if you're in a hardcore cult, like, Heaven's Gate or Jonestown, or like a real cult, or even just a group that uses cultic thought reform tactics. So like, I would not say that I was raised in a cult, but I definitely would say that I was thought reformed. When you come out of a cult, Stephen Hassan and Dr. Margaret Singer, these are like cult psychologists and psychiatrists, they basically say that you almost immediately revert back to your original worldview. You almost have this like second dual personality, a cult personality that like takes over when you're in a cult. And when you leave a cult, you go back to your original self. But for somebody like me, who was indoctrinated from birth into white Christian nationalism, when I deconstructed from that, there was no original worldview or personality to revert back to. So I think that is why, a lot of people are so struggling with deconstruction, especially from childhood, because we have to rebuild an entire worldview, an entire understanding of like how the world works, what we believe, what we don't believe, what is like our faith, our personality, our social connections. We have to rebuild all of that from scratch as an adult. And it leaves you kind of floundering. And when I was floundering, simultaneously looking at this mountain of information that was like, what is QAnon? What is conspiracy theories? What is all of that stuff? Once I kind of, got over that, I was again left at like the foot of this mountain of information of what are cults, what is the history of racism, what is the history of misogyny, what is the history of the church, how does this tie to fascism, populism? What is socialism and communism? Because I've only ever been taught that they're just evil, but that doesn't seem to be right. It makes, if there's no hell, if there's no heaven, if there's, is abortion the horrible evil that I was always taught it to be? Like, you have to question everything. But I have, because of my education, done difficult things before, like I processed vast quantities of information. And, you know, I got my degree and I've done it before. And the job that I work now for the Navy, I went through another very intensive training program. So I've done it before. So I think that just kind of gave me more of a confidence than maybe some of my friends back home would have, to sit down and try to even just try to go through it all.
That is very true. You know, I went through a very difficult degree too. After my bachelor's, I went to law school. So, you know, that was a lot of stuff to digest. And, you know, even though I'm not practicing as a lawyer right now for various reasons, I learned a lot. You know, I learned how to analyze vast amounts of information, which is helping me with my current job as a writer. And, you know, this is something that one should not take for granted, I was thinking, because, you know, a lot of people will be daunted. They will not be able to process so much information and they would give up. But people who have taken these degrees or done things that require this much effort, they know how it is like to go through this process.
Well, and that's also why cults are so effective and high control religions are so effective, because they isolate you so much from the outside world that to venture outside of your bubble is too scary. So most people just don't. And then they simultaneously, like we were talking about with homeschooling and everything, they strip you of the tools that you would have to do that, even if you chose to. So, yeah.
Exactly. So, final question. Your book has a very important message about the increasing polarization of politics and beliefs in the US. How will you be marketing your book? Will you be going on any, you know, big name talk shows and podcasts?
So, we're still early days. The book is not fully written. I don't have like a completed manuscript yet. Like I said, I'm about halfway done with the drafting. Um, so that's all, I think, a little bit farther out. I have been talking on a series of podcasts, such as yourself, and I'm just really excited to like talk to people who have, you know, a similar experience and are kind of going through the same thing, but also just kind of a little bit. I have a social media platform on Instagram. I have the website. I will be ramping up hopefully, you know, if anybody will have me, ramping up. I have also talked about potentially starting, you know, after the book is written, starting like a podcast, talking about the topics that are in the book, just to try to get it out a little bit more. And it's really just going to be a matter of like what opportunities are available at the time. So, you know, I'm open to podcasts or, you know, even in-person speaking engagements, events, whatever. And I will be improving the website and adding some resources on that as the book is closer to completion as well.
That makes a lot of sense. Yes, it is a good idea to, you know, start thinking about that when you're done your book, because then you'll have a better idea of what to say and what to do from there.
Right. And I think that it will appeal to a lot of different spheres of interest. So, you know, talking to deconstruction people in the deconstruction media space, people who are talking about cults, talking about conspiracy theories, talking about politics. So I think that there's like a lot of different, you know, spaces where this could be relevant. And I just am looking forward to, you know, connecting a little bit more.
Right. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Cynane. This was a wonderful conversation. We learned so much about your book and, you know, all these politics and beliefs that are running amok. And, you know, I can't wait for your book to be released. You know, this will be a very exciting book, and it will go right next to Jesus and John Wayne on my bookshelf.
Oh my God.
And all the other books I'm buying about this topic, because it's very intriguing.
Yes, everybody just like go read all of the books that I've read.
Yes. All right. Thank you so much. See you next time.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.